Hey guys, this week's devotional, just wanted to start a series. So I have been reading through the gospel of all four of the gospels, and I'm in the middle of Mark right now. And if you've been if you've been a Christian for a little while, or you've been in church your whole life like I have, then you've kind of heard certain stories and heard and read through certain things bunches and bunches of times, and it kind of can get like you just kind of gloss over it, and it can become familiar to you. And so as I was reading through Mark, I kind of had that impression. I was reading like, man, I've heard this before, okay, I got that. And I came to a part in Mark 4 where Jesus is teaching a bunch of people, and in that piece he starts to talk in parables. Parables just a story to illustrate a point. And he's reading in Mark 4, and at the beginning of Mark 4 he hits a very familiar parable to me, and it's the parable of the sower. And so if you look at if you know anything about parable sower, essentially it's a story about a farmer or a planter that throws out seed to sow into the ground so that it would produce crops. And he says there's four different types of sowing, or four different places that it lands, and four different impacts that it has, or effects that it has. And so what I want to do over the next 4 weeks is talk about each specific seed and where it lands, and the soil that it lands in, and why it doesn't live, or why it does produce fruit, or whatever happens. And so if you look at Mark 4, I'm going to read verses 1 through 9 to you. If you want to read along, get a Bible, pause this video, whatever. But here's verses 1 through 9. This is just the actual parable. Below Mark 4, in verses 14 through 20, he kind of explains it. So check this out. Verse 1, he says, "And again he began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat in it on the sea. And the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. And he was teaching them many things in parables. And in his teaching he said to them, 'Listen, a sower went to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell among the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seeds fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And he said, he who has ears, let him hear.'" And so for a couple of just kind of quick points on the analogy. One, you have the sower. So somebody who is sowing seeds or putting seeds out to grow. That person in this analogy is Jesus, or as a continuation of Jesus, believers, people who proclaim the gospel, right? People who give the word or give truth about the Bible to the world. And just to be straight, that is anybody that believes in Jesus. That's the mandate on your life, that you would take the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, that he came, died for our sins, rose from there, that we might have life in him, right? That's the message we're supposed to be giving to the world. And so if you're a Christian, in this analogy, he's talking specifically about Jesus, really looking at Pharisees and looking at religious leaders, but the continuation of that analogy is that we would do the same thing. We would take the message of the gospel to the world. And then secondly, you've got the seed. So the seed itself in this parable is essentially the word, or the gospel, right? It is the good news of Jesus Christ. So he is sowing that, or throwing that to all kinds of different soils out there and getting lots of different effects. And then also there's the soil, and that's really the concentration of the parable, is there's four different impacts in the soil. We're going to talk specifically about the first soil, or essentially if you look at that soil, what happens when it lands on that soil. And remember that humanity, or mankind, I am the soil in this analogy. Your friends are the soil, your community are the soil, the world is the soil. And so what he says is, if you look at the beginning, we're talking about specifically the first seeds. He said, as he sowed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. So what we know is that there was some seeds that went out to ground that wasn't really designed to receive seeds, okay? And so it literally says that it fell along the path. The word for along the path there is the word for para, right? And para in Greek literally can mean in, or on, or beside the path. So it literally is like he's going to the field to sow, and some seeds fall out, right? And then Jesus kind of tells us in verse 15 what specifically is the deal with those seeds. And I'll be straight, I read this and have a hard time with these seeds. I can kind of understand the other three and the impact they have, and whether they grow or don't grow, or they get choked out, or whether they produce grain. But this one I've struggled the most with in the last couple weeks, and really over the course of my life. And it's just because it's hard for me to accept the truth of this. And so in verse 15, as Jesus is explaining this, Jesus says, talking about that specific seed, And these are the ones along the path where the word is sown. When they hear, listen to this, this is so hard. Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. So I read that and I hear, they hear the gospel and Satan takes it away. They hear the good news of Jesus Christ, the news they need, that non-Christians need in order to be saved, and Satan takes it away. My big problem, I don't like that Satan has that power. I wish he didn't. The Bible tells me he does. 2, I wish that I had the power to sow it just correctly enough that Satan couldn't take it away. And so when I read this, I want y'all to hear the truth of this. If I break down that one seed, what Jesus has just told us is that there is going to be seeds that we sow as believers. If you're a believer and you're sending out the word, you're explaining the gospel, sharing the gospel, being an evangelist, there are going to be times when you do that and it's going to fall on soil that's just not fertile. That literally in other like in Matthew and in Luke, or Matthew and in Luke, it says that it arrives on hard ground or rocky ground. And if you look at like Proverbs 28:14 or Hebrews 3:13, where it says that like our hearts or our minds are hardened, that makes sense. Like sometimes we're gonna send the gospel out, we're gonna share the gospel with somebody, and Satan's just gonna snatch it up. Like they're not prepared to receive it. And God just tells us that hard truth, that ultimately that sometimes the word, the gospel message, is just never going to take root. It's going to fall beside the path, and that many people are just going to reject it completely and immediately. And that's a hard thing for me to swallow. If I think about my friends, my family, people that I love, that maybe they're this soil, that's a hard pill for me. But I think I have to remember something true, that ultimately my job is just to be the guy that shares the seed, that sows the seed. I don't grow it, I don't produce it, I don't make it produce 100-fold. I'm not in charge of that, and I don't have that power. And so if I make this parable a man-centered, Spencer-centered parable where, hey Spencer, it's your job to make sure you not only plant it just right, you water it just right, you got to handle all the perfect things, and then you're in control of it growing. Man, this parable scares me to death, because I'm going to be so afraid of how I say things and what I say, and because I gotta get it just right, because if you mess it up, you could ruin the only chance in the world that somebody comes to know Jesus, and that could be all your fault. So if you're a man-centered guy or girl or believer where this is, you believe you've got to set it just right because you're in charge of the growth of that seed, this passage is going to be a big burden. But look at the passage. Who grows it? Jesus does. God is in charge of the growth. My job is just to sow the seed. And so what's ultimately encouraging to me about this passage is that if Satan has snatched it up, that is not my fault. I am not at fault for that. And ultimately, if it had been successful, that's not my fault either. That ultimately my calling is just to sow the seed, that God does the growing, God does the producing, God softens hearts, God has people receive the gospel, God is in charge of that word being implanted in their heart, growing deep roots and producing fruit. I am not God, and I cannot do it. Amen. Right? Like, we as Christians are not responsible for anything except sharing the good news of the gospel. And should they receive it and produce fruit and become believers, then it's our job to then help water it, grow it, and discipleship. Our job is to be a part of their lives, to help them see the truths of the gospel, and help them read the Bible, create good patterns of discipline, those kinds of things. But our job is not our fault if people don't receive the gospel. That is God's work, God's choice, and God's doing. We are simply called as disciples to go and spread the word to the world, to make disciples, right? And to share the good news of the gospel. And so my hope, if you're a Christian hearing this message, one, this should challenge you to go spread some seeds, to go share the gospel. But also, it also should be a comfort to you that if it isn't successful in the way you plan it, if you say it just the way you think you should and it doesn't produce any fruit, that's not your fault. You've done that. You've been obedient. You may have put a seed down that somebody comes along and waters later, or that God produces later. It is just your job. And hope and take comfort and take that burden off your back to know that it is just your job to share the gospel. As a non-believer, my hope is that you would hear this word, right? And maybe soften your heart. My hope is that this is a seed that I'm giving to you, and that hard soil that's in your mind and in your heart and in your brain might soften. My prayer is that the word itself, that the good news that Jesus Christ died for your sin, for our sin, so that we could live a life at peace and in harmony and relationship with God through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I hope that word is received in your heart, and that this hard, rocky soil that is your heart right now might soften, receive the gospel, right? You might grow deep roots and then produce fruit. That's my hope. So hopefully that's good. We'll come back next week and talk a little more about the second, the third, and the fourth seed. But each week I'm going to kind of elaborate. This one's the longest one because I had to give some intro. So love you guys. See you next week.